What if the greatest mistake an empath ever makes is believing that their ability to understand someone's pain means they are responsible for healing it? What if the reason you became exhausted, emotionally numb, and strangely empty after helping everyone around you was not because you cared too much? What if you were carrying a responsibility that was never yours? There is a moment in the evolution of a deeply sensitive person when something inside them finally breaks. Not their heart, not their compassion. An illusion. The illusion that if you understand someone's trauma deeply enough, you can save them from themselves. The illusion that if you love someone enough, they will eventually become capable of loving you properly. The illusion that your ability to see someone's wounds means you have been chosen to repair them. And this is where the idea of the Sophia-Stage empath becomes psychologically fascinating. The phrase itself is not a formal Jungian category. Carl Jung did not create a clinical stage called the Sophia-Stage empath. But his ideas about individuation, the shadow, projection, and the development of the self give us a powerful framework for understanding what this stage can represent. Sophia, in its symbolic meaning, points toward wisdom. Not information, not intelligence, wisdom. The kind of wisdom that arrives only after compassion has been tested by suffering. At the beginning of an empath's journey, compassion often feels like an obligation. You see someone hurting, and immediately you want to help. Someone is angry, and you search for the wound beneath their anger. Someone is cruel, and you ask what happened to them. Someone betrays you, and instead of asking, "Why did they do this to me?" you ask, "What pain caused them to become this way?" That question can reveal enormous emotional intelligence. But it can also become a trap, because eventually, the empath begins explaining behavior that should simply be confronted. They excuse disrespect because they understand trauma. They tolerate manipulation because they understand insecurity. They forgive repeated betrayal because they understand fear. They remain in unhealthy relationships because they can see the wounded child hiding behind the adult. And slowly, something dangerous happens. Understanding replaces boundaries, compassion replaces discernment, and empathy becomes self-abandonment. Jung's concept of projection becomes extremely important here. Human beings frequently place aspects of themselves that they cannot consciously accept onto other people. The person who cannot tolerate their own weakness may attack weakness in others. The person who cannot face their own insecurity may accuse someone else of being insecure. The person who refuses to acknowledge their own aggression may constantly describe everyone around them as hostile. And a highly sensitive person can become especially vulnerable to this dynamic because they are often exceptionally skilled at sensing emotional states. They notice subtle changes, a different tone, a longer pause, a strange expression. A shift in someone's energy, a sentence that sounds harmless but carries resentment underneath it. The empath notices, and because they notice, they feel responsible. They begin adjusting themselves around everyone else's emotional weather. If someone is angry, they become smaller. If someone is sad, they become available. If someone is insecure, they reassure them. If someone is disappointed, they blame themselves. If someone is cruel, they search for an explanation. Eventually, their entire identity becomes organized around emotional regulation, not their own, everyone else's. And that is where the supposed gift becomes a psychological prison. Because you cannot build an authentic self if your entire personality exists to keep everyone else comfortable. Jung's process of individuation points in the opposite direction. Individuation is the movement toward becoming psychologically whole. And becoming whole does not mean becoming endlessly agreeable. It means becoming capable of recognizing what belongs to you and what does not. Your emotions, their emotions, your responsibility, their responsibility, your shadow, their shadow. Your choices, their choices. This distinction is everything, because the immature empath asks, how can I make them feel better? The developing empath asks, why are they behaving this way? But the Sophia-Stage empath asks something much deeper. Is this mine to carry at all? That question changes everything. Imagine someone comes to you with the same problem every week. You listen, you advise, you reassure, you sacrifice your time, you absorb their emotional chaos. And then they return the next week with the exact same behavior. Eventually you realize something painful. They weren't looking for transformation, they were looking for a container. They wanted somewhere to place their emotional burden. And you volunteered to become that place. This is why the mature empath eventually discovers that compassion without boundaries can become a form of unconscious participation. You can love someone without rescuing them. You can understand someone without agreeing with them. You can recognize someone's trauma without allowing that trauma to become an excuse for harming you. And perhaps most importantly, you can care about someone's healing without becoming their healer. This is the transition into the symbolic Sophia-Stage. The empath stops asking, "How much can I give?" and starts asking, "What is actually mine to give?" That is wisdom, because wisdom knows that not every wound is an invitation. Not every broken person is your assignment. Not every relationship is your responsibility. And not every person who needs help has chosen to change. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is step back, not because you stopped caring, but because you finally understand that another adult's transformation cannot be completed by your suffering. And this is where the next revelation begins. Because once the empath stops trying to heal everyone, they discover something terrifying. Some people were never attracted to their compassion. They were attracted to their willingness to carry what they refused to carry themselves. And when that willingness disappears, the entire relationship changes. That is when the empath's transformation truly begins. You ever notice that the more deeply you understand someone, the easier it becomes to forgive what should have been a warning? You see their childhood, their insecurity, their abandonment wounds, their fear, their shame, their loneliness, and suddenly the person hurting you becomes someone you feel sorry for. This is one of the most dangerous psychological traps for a sensitive person. Because compassion can become so powerful that it blinds you to consequence. Jung's concept of the shadow helps explain why. The shadow represents aspects of ourselves that remain outside conscious identity. Aggression, jealousy, neediness, control, envy, selfishness, fear, even our capacity for cruelty. The goal of psychological development is not to pretend these qualities don't exist. It is to become conscious of them, because what remains unconscious can control us. And the same principle applies to relationships. When someone refuses to confront their own destructive tendencies, they may unconsciously project them outward. Suddenly, you're the selfish one, you're the difficult one, you're too emotional, you're too demanding, you're the problem. And if you are highly empathic, you may immediately begin investigating yourself. Maybe I'm being too sensitive. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe they had a difficult day. Maybe their childhood explains this. Maybe I should be more patient. Notice what just happened. Their behavior became your psychological homework. This is where the empath can become trapped. They turn inward to find an explanation for someone else's behavior, while completely ignoring the behavioral evidence in front of them. The Sophia-Stage transformation requires a different question. Not, why are they like this? But, what are they repeatedly choosing to do? That distinction is profound, because understanding causes does not erase consequences. A person can have trauma and still be responsible for how they treat you. A person can have abandonment wounds and still be responsible for manipulation. A person can have insecurity and still be responsible for cruelty. A person can have pain and still cause pain. Compassion does not require you to become the casualty of someone else's unconsciousness. And this is why the mature empath develops something that looks almost like emotional detachment. But it isn't coldness, it is differentiation. They can sit beside someone else's suffering without immediately making it their own. They can say, "I understand why you're hurting," without saying, "I will hurt with you until I disappear." That is the difference. The immature empath merges. The awakened empath relates. One loses themselves inside another person's emotional world. The other remains present while maintaining a psychological center. This is deeply connected to individuation. Jung's psychological journey was not about becoming perfectly detached from humanity. It was about becoming more fully oneself. And the Sophia-Stage empath eventually realizes that becoming oneself requires disappointing people who benefited from the old version. This is one of the hardest parts, because when you stop rescuing people, they may accuse you of changing. And they are right. You have changed. You no longer answer every message immediately. You no longer explain yourself endlessly. You no longer apologize simply because someone is upset. You no longer rush to repair every conflict. You no longer interpret someone's anger as proof that you did something wrong. And suddenly, people who were comfortable with your endless availability may become uncomfortable with your boundaries. This is where many empaths panic. They think, maybe I've become selfish. But selfishness and self-respect are not the same thing. Selfishness says, only my needs matter. Healthy boundaries say, my needs matter too. That tiny word changes everything. Too many sensitive people were taught that goodness means endless giving, but endless giving without discernment does not necessarily produce goodness. Sometimes it produces resentment. Sometimes it produces dependency. Sometimes it teaches another person that they never have to take responsibility. And sometimes it creates the exact relationship the empath claims to hate, a relationship where one person carries and the other person consumes. The Sophia-Stage empath breaks that pattern, not through revenge, not through cruelty, not by becoming emotionally unavailable, but through consciousness. They stop confusing compassion with rescue. They stop confusing understanding with permission. They stop confusing forgiveness with reconciliation. And they stop confusing someone's potential with their present behavior. This is particularly important in relationships involving narcissistic patterns. A person with strong narcissistic defenses may be deeply uncomfortable with accountability. They may shift blame, rewrite events, minimize harm, demand admiration, punish boundaries. And when an empath begins withdrawing from the role of emotional caretaker, the relationship can become unstable. Why? Because the old psychological arrangement is collapsing. The empath used to absorb. Now they observe. The empath used to explain. Now they discern. The empath used to repair. Now they allow consequences. And this is where projection loses its power. You don't have to prove that someone is projecting. You simply stop accepting responsibility for what belongs to them. Someone says you're selfish. You examine your behavior. If you acted unfairly, you correct it. If you didn't, you don't spend 3 days destroying yourself trying to disprove an accusation. Someone says you're cold because you established a boundary. You ask yourself whether the boundary is reasonable. If it is, you keep it. This is psychological maturity. The goal isn't to become impossible to criticize. The goal is to become capable of evaluating criticism without automatically surrendering your identity to it. And this is the beginning of sovereignty. The Sophia-Stage empath doesn't become powerful because they can read everyone. They become powerful because they no longer need everyone to approve of what they see. Their compassion becomes selective. Their attention becomes sacred. Their energy becomes intentional. And most importantly, they stop trying to complete another person's psychological journey for them, because there is a brutal truth every mature empath eventually learns. You can walk beside someone. You can encourage them. You can love them. You can tell them the truth. You can offer support, but you cannot do their inner work. You cannot integrate their shadow. You cannot develop their self-awareness. You cannot make them accountable. And you cannot heal a wound belonging to someone who refuses to look at it. Once you understand this, your compassion stops being a leak. It becomes a choice, and that choice prepares you for the next stage. The moment you stop being everyone's emotional medicine and discover what your sensitivity was actually trying to teach you. What if your sensitivity was never designed to make you responsible for everyone? What if it was designed to help you perceive what others overlook? And what if the real transformation happens when you stop using that perception to rescue people and start using it to understand reality? This is where compassion becomes discernment. At the beginning of the empath's journey, sensitivity feels automatic. You enter a room and immediately sense tension. You speak to someone and detect sadness beneath their smile. You hear someone's words and notice the emotion underneath them. You can feel when something is wrong before anyone says it. But perception without boundaries can become overwhelming. You notice everything, and because you notice everything, you feel responsible for everything. The Sophia-Stage empath learns to separate these two things. Awareness does not equal responsibility. Seeing does not mean fixing. Understanding does not mean carrying. This is one of the most important psychological distinctions a sensitive person can make. You can notice someone's anger without absorbing it. You can recognize someone's insecurity without becoming responsible for soothing it. You can understand someone's trauma without allowing trauma to dictate your life. You can love someone and still say no. That is not a contradiction. That is mature compassion. Jung's concept of individuation provides a useful symbolic map here. The individual moves away from unconscious identification with external expectations and toward a deeper relationship with the self. For the empath, this can mean something very specific. You stop defining yourself by how useful you are to other people. Think about that. Who are you when nobody needs your advice? Who are you when nobody is in crisis? Who are you when you aren't calming someone down? Who are you when you aren't solving a problem? Many empaths discover that these questions are uncomfortable because they built identity around usefulness. They became the listener, the fixer, the understanding one, the emotionally intelligent one. The person everyone called at midnight, and being needed felt like being loved, but those are not necessarily the same thing. Being needed can create attachment. Being loved creates relationship. A person can need your emotional labor without truly seeing you. And the Sophia-Stage empath begins recognizing this difference. They ask, does this relationship know me or only use what I provide? That question can expose years of imbalance. Perhaps you were always listening but rarely heard, always forgiving but rarely considered, always understanding but rarely understood, always making space but never receiving space, always carrying the emotional weight while the other person called it love. Eventually, the nervous system becomes exhausted, and the empath thinks, something is wrong with me. But sometimes the problem isn't that you feel too much. Sometimes the problem is that you have been giving too much access to people who take without reciprocity. This is why boundaries are not walls. They are filters. A wall says, nobody gets in. A boundary says you don't get unlimited access. That difference is enormous. The awakened empath doesn't become less loving. They become more precise about where love goes. They begin noticing patterns. Who respects a no? Who punishes a no? Who can apologize? Who only apologizes when consequences appear? Who celebrates your growth? Who becomes threatened by it? Who listens when you speak? Who only listens when they need something? These observations become more valuable than emotional promises. Because mature empathy is not merely feeling what someone might be experiencing. It is observing what they consistently choose. And this is where the Sophia-Stage empath becomes difficult to manipulate. Not because they become suspicious of everyone, but because they stop abandoning evidence for potential. They don't say, he's kind deep down. They ask, how does he consistently treat people? They don't say, she doesn't mean it. They ask, what happens every time I establish a boundary? They don't say, they're wounded. They ask, are they taking responsibility for their wounds? These questions create clarity, and clarity changes relationships. Some relationships become healthier. Some relationships end. Some people rise to meet the new standard. Others disappear because the old arrangement no longer benefits them. This can feel lonely. But loneliness during transformation is not always failure. Sometimes it is the space where identity reorganizes. The empath who spent years surrounded by people may suddenly prefer silence, not because they hate people, because they are finally hearing themselves. They start spending time alone. They notice their own thoughts, their own preferences, their own anger, their own desires, their own dreams. And something surprising happens. They discover that beneath all the emotional noise was a person they had barely met, This is why the Sophia-Stage is not about becoming superhuman. It is about becoming human in a more conscious way. You don't stop feeling, you stop being ruled by everything you feel. You don't stop caring, you stop sacrificing yourself automatically. You don't stop seeing people's wounds. You stop treating their wounds as instructions. And perhaps the greatest transformation is this. You become comfortable allowing people to experience the consequences of their own choices. This can be incredibly difficult for an empath, because watching someone struggle can trigger the instinct to intervene. But sometimes intervention prevents learning. If you repeatedly rescue someone from consequences, they never develop the capacity to navigate consequences. If you repeatedly solve their emotional problems, they never develop emotional responsibility. If you repeatedly forgive without requiring change, forgiveness becomes permission. The Sophia-Stage empath understands something deeply compassionate. People need the dignity of their own journey. You cannot live another person's life for them. You cannot grow on their behalf. You cannot choose courage for them. You cannot face their shadow for them. And you cannot become conscious for them. Your role is not to drag people toward awakening. Your role is to become awake enough that you no longer participate in what destroys you. This is why the mature empath may appear less available than before. They aren't less compassionate. They are more conscious. They have discovered that compassion without discernment can accidentally reinforce dysfunction. So they choose differently. They help where help is welcomed. They listen where listening is reciprocal. They forgive without necessarily reopening the door. They love without surrendering themselves. They walk away without needing to turn the other person into a villain. And that last part is important, because true psychological sovereignty does not require hatred. You don't have to hate someone to stop participating in their pattern. You don't have to expose them. You don't have to punish them. You don't even have to convince them that you were right. Sometimes the deepest boundary is simply, I understand you, and I choose differently. That sentence contains the entire transformation. The old empath asks, how do I make everyone okay? The Sophia-Stage empath asks, how do I remain whole while responding wisely? And that question opens the door to the deepest realization of all. You were never meant to become humanity's emotional dumping ground. Your sensitivity was not a command to suffer. It was an invitation to become conscious. There is a moment when an empath stops rescuing someone and watches something unexpected happen. Nothing collapses, the person survives, the crisis passes, the world keeps turning, and the empath realizes, I was carrying something they were capable of carrying themselves. That realization can be devastating, because it forces you to reconsider years of behavior. How many times did you interrupt your own peace to regulate someone else's emotions? How many times did you cancel your plans because someone needed you? How many times did you accept disrespect because you knew where it came from? How many times did you stay because leaving felt cruel? How many times did you call your self-sacrifice love? The Sophia-Stage empath begins asking these questions without self-hatred. They understand that the old version of themselves was not stupid. It was trying to survive. Maybe helping people made them feel safe. Maybe being needed gave them identity. Maybe keeping everyone happy prevented conflict. Maybe they learned early that love had to be earned through usefulness. Whatever the origin, the pattern eventually becomes visible. And once something becomes conscious, it becomes possible to change. This is why individuation can feel like a death. The old identity has to loosen. The identity of the rescuer, the endlessly patient one, the person who never says no, the person who understands everything, the person who can tolerate anything. That person may have been admired, but they were also exhausted, and now a new identity emerges. Not the healer of everyone, the guardian of their own consciousness. This is a completely different role. The mature empath does not ask, who needs me? They ask, where is my presence actually meaningful? That question changes how they spend their energy. They stop giving their deepest attention to people who repeatedly create chaos. They stop treating emotional emergencies as automatic invitations. They stop allowing another person's lack of preparation to become their emergency, and slowly their life becomes quieter. But inside that quiet, something powerful develops. Choice, the ability to pause before responding, the ability to say, "Let me think about that." The ability to leave a message unanswered until you're ready. The ability to say, "I can't help with this." The ability to say, "I care about you, but this is something you need to handle." To someone who spent years over-functioning, these sentences can feel almost violent. But they aren't. They are boundaries. And boundaries reveal character. The right people adjust. The wrong people attack. That distinction can save years of your life. Because someone who genuinely cares about you may be disappointed by your boundary, but they will eventually respect it. Someone who benefits from your lack of boundaries may attempt to destroy it. They may call you selfish, cold, changed, arrogant, uncaring, difficult, and the old empath would immediately panic. The Sophia-Stage empath pauses. They ask, "Is their disappointment evidence that my boundary is wrong?" Usually no. Discomfort is not proof of wrongdoing. Sometimes your boundary simply prevents someone from getting what they were accustomed to receiving. And that is precisely why it feels threatening. This is particularly powerful in narcissistic dynamics. A person who relied on your constant emotional availability may experience your independence as rejection. Your silence becomes punishment. Your boundaries become cruelty. Your self-respect becomes ego. Your refusal to argue becomes emotional manipulation. The accusations can become intense, but the mature empath no longer enters every courtroom where someone demands their defense. They understand that not every accusation deserves an explanation. Sometimes explanation feeds the cycle. Sometimes the most powerful response is consistency. You said no. You keep saying no. You don't scream. You don't insult. You don't retaliate. You simply stop participating. That is psychological sovereignty. And something fascinating happens when you stop rescuing people. You discover who they are without your intervention. Without you solving the problem, what do? Without you apologizing first, what happens? Without you repairing the conflict, do they attempt repair? Without you providing emotional reassurance, can they regulate themselves? Without you taking responsibility, do they take theirs? Your withdrawal from the rescuer role becomes an experiment, not a manipulation, an observation. And the results reveal more than years of conversations could. This is why the Sophia-Stage empath becomes less fascinated by words. They watch behavior. Words can describe intentions. Behavior reveals patterns. And patterns reveal reality. The mature empath doesn't need to diagnose everyone. They don't need to label everyone narcissistic. They don't need to understand every psychological mechanism. They simply need enough awareness to recognize, this relationship repeatedly harms me. That is enough. You don't need a courtroom verdict to leave a situation that destroys your peace. You don't need someone's permission to protect yourself. And you don't need to prove that the other person is evil before choosing distance. This is another major difference between immature and mature empathy. The immature empath often needs moral certainty. They're bad, so I can leave. The mature empath understands they may be complicated, they may be wounded. They may even love me in their own way, and this relationship may still be unhealthy for me. That is sophisticated compassion. It allows complexity without sacrificing discernment. You don't have to turn someone into a monster to justify your boundary. You can recognize their humanity and still walk away. This is where the empath becomes truly difficult to manipulate, because manipulation often depends on forcing you into extremes. Either you forgive completely, or you're cruel. Either you stay, or you never loved them. Either you rescue them, or you're selfish. The Sophia-Stage empath refuses the false choice. They choose the middle path: compassion with boundaries, love with discernment, understanding with accountability, forgiveness with distance when necessary. And this is why they were never meant to heal everyone, because their highest development does not lie in becoming everyone's medicine. It lies in becoming responsible for their own consciousness. And once that happens, something even deeper begins. The empath starts realizing that their greatest healing may not come from saving other people at all. It comes from finally meeting themselves. What happens when the person who spent their entire life being emotionally available finally becomes unavailable to chaos? At first it feels wrong, then it feels peaceful, and eventually it feels like freedom. The Sophia-Stage empath discovers that one of the deepest addictions of sensitivity is not attention. It is being needed. Being needed can feel like purpose. When everyone calls you, you feel important. When everyone trusts you with their secrets, you feel valuable. When everyone depends on your emotional strength, you feel irreplaceable. But there is a hidden danger. If your identity depends on being needed, you may unconsciously choose relationships where people need rescuing. Not because you want them to suffer, because their suffering gives you a role, and once that role disappears, you are forced to ask the terrifying question: who am I if nobody needs me? That is where individuation becomes real. The answer cannot come from another person. It has to emerge from within. You begin discovering your preferences, what you like, what you don't like, what you believe, what you want, what you refuse, what you value, what you fear, what you desire. What kind of life actually feels like yours? This may sound ordinary. For an empath who has spent years adapting to everyone else, it can be revolutionary. They may realize they don't even know what they want anymore. They know what everyone else wants. They know how everyone else feels. They know how to make everyone comfortable. But their own inner voice has become quiet. So the healing process becomes less about absorbing more wisdom, and more about recovering the voice that was buried beneath everyone else's expectations. Jung's idea of the self becomes relevant here. The self is not simply the social personality. It represents a deeper organizing center of the psyche. The journey toward it requires confronting the masks we have built, and the empath has a particularly complicated mask, the mask of goodness, the mask that says, I am the one who understands. I don't get angry. I can forgive anything. I don't need much. I can handle it. I'll be there. But no human being can live permanently inside that mask without consequences. Eventually the suppressed anger emerges, the resentment, the exhaustion, the loneliness, the feeling of being unseen. The Sophia-Stage empath doesn't destroy these emotions. They listen to them because anger can contain information. Resentment can reveal an ignored boundary. Exhaustion can reveal overextension. Loneliness can reveal emotional imbalance. The goal is not to become permanently positive. The goal is to become psychologically honest. Sometimes honesty says, I don't want to do this. Sometimes it says, that hurt me. Sometimes it says, I don't trust you anymore. Sometimes it says, I love you, but I cannot continue this relationship in its current form. These statements can feel terrifying, but they are signs that the empath is becoming differentiated. And differentiation does not mean isolation. It means connection without fusion. You can be close to someone without becoming them. You can love someone without absorbing their emotional state. You can hear their pain without allowing it to dictate your choices. This is where sensitivity becomes powerful. Before, sensitivity controlled you. Now you use it. You notice. You pause. You interpret. You choose. That is mastery. The empath's nervous system may still notice the tension in a room, but instead of immediately thinking, how do I fix this? They think, interesting. Something is happening here. That tiny shift transforms perception into information. And information gives you choice. You don't have to enter every emotional field you detect. You don't have to resolve every conflict. You don't have to absorb every sadness. You can observe. This is one reason solitude can become deeply restorative for the mature empath. Silence creates contrast. When you're constantly surrounded by emotional noise, you may mistake other people's feelings for your own. But when you become quiet, you begin noticing, this anxiety wasn't mine. This guilt wasn't mine. This urgency wasn't mine. This anger wasn't mine. And sometimes that realization is heartbreaking, because you recognize how much of your identity was constructed around emotions you inherited from your environment. But it is also liberating. You start returning emotional responsibility to its rightful owner, not cruelly, not aggressively, simply consciously. You stop carrying what doesn't belong to you. And this creates a strange side effect. Some people may no longer recognize you. The person who used to answer immediately now takes time. The person who used to argue now disengages. The person who used to explain now says less. The person who used to chase now lets people walk. The person who used to beg for understanding now understands themselves. This is the point where many people mistake healing for hardness. But there is a difference between becoming hard and becoming solid. Hardness says, I don't need anyone. Solidness says, I can love people without losing myself. Hardness rejects vulnerability. Coldness makes vulnerability intentional. Hardness avoids connection. Coldness chooses connection wisely. The Sophia-Stage empath becomes solid. And this is why they were never meant to heal everyone. Because their deepest responsibility is not to maintain everyone else's emotional equilibrium. It is to maintain contact with their own truth. That truth may sometimes require helping. Other times, it may require walking away. Sometimes compassion means holding someone's hand. Other times, compassion means refusing to hold them up when they are capable of standing. This is not abandonment, it is respect. You are respecting their capacity. You are respecting your limits. You are respecting reality. And reality is often more compassionate than fantasy. Fantasy says, if I love them enough, they will change. Reality says, they will change when they decide to change. Fantasy says, if I explain myself perfectly, they will finally understand. Reality says, people understand what they are willing to understand. Fantasy says, if I stay long enough, I can save them. Reality says, nobody can be saved against their will. This is the wisdom of the Sophia-Stage. It is not mystical superiority. It is psychological maturity. You stop confusing potential with reality. You stop confusing promises with patterns. You stop confusing guilt with responsibility. And you stop confusing empathy with obligation. Then something extraordinary happens. Your compassion becomes cleaner. When you help, you actually want to help. Not because you're afraid of rejection. Not because you need approval. Not because you fear what happens if you say no. You help because you choose to, and because you choose to, you can also choose not to. That is freedom. What if the people who call you selfish after you heal are not necessarily reacting to your selfishness? What if they are reacting to the loss of access they once had to you? This is one of the most painful discoveries in emotional transformation. When your boundaries become stronger, some relationships become uncomfortable. Not because boundaries are harmful, because boundaries reveal the structure of the relationship. If someone respects you, the relationship adapts. If someone depended on your self-abandonment, the relationship destabilizes. And that distinction is incredibly revealing. Consider the empath who spent years saying yes, yes to extra work, yes to emotional support, yes to endless conversations, yes to apologies they didn't owe, yes to fixing problems they didn't create. Then one day they say no, nothing dramatic, just no. And suddenly the other person becomes angry. You've changed. You don't care anymore. You think you're better than us. You're becoming selfish. For years, the empath thought love meant saying yes. Now they discover that some people love the access created by that yes. This does not mean every angry response proves manipulation. People can genuinely feel hurt by change. But the mature empath doesn't automatically surrender their boundary simply because someone dislikes it. They evaluate, is it fair? Is it necessary? Is it communicated respectfully? If yes, discomfort does not invalidate it. This is psychological differentiation, and it is one of the hardest skills for a highly sensitive person to develop, because sensitivity creates an intense awareness of consequences. You can feel someone else's disappointment. You can sense their anger. You can imagine their pain, and because you can imagine it, you may rush to remove it. But mature empathy learns to tolerate another person's temporary discomfort without immediately rescuing them. That is enormous growth. Because sometimes people need to experience disappointment. Sometimes they need to hear no. Sometimes they need to solve their own problem. Sometimes they need to recognize that your availability is not guaranteed. and sometimes they need to confront the fact that their behavior has consequences. The empath who prevents every uncomfortable emotion around them may accidentally prevent emotional growth. This is why boundaries are not punishments. They are information. They communicate, this is what I can participate in, this is what I cannot, this is what I will accept, this is what I will leave. And the Sophia-Stage empath learns not to negotiate these statements endlessly. They communicate them once. Then they watch, because behavior after the boundary tells you more than the conversation before it. Someone who respects you may say, I don't like this, but I understand. Someone who wants control may say, you're abandoning me. Someone healthy may adapt. Someone dependent on your overgiving may escalate. And sometimes the escalation is what finally wakes the empath up, because they see clearly. The relationship worked only when I was betraying myself. That realization hurts. But it also frees you. Jung's shadow work is not about becoming morally perfect. It is about becoming conscious of what you have denied. For the empath, one of those denied truths may be this: I have limits. Another may be, I get angry. Another, I don't want to save everyone. Another, I sometimes resent people who constantly take from me. These admissions are not failures. They are consciousness, because what you refuse to acknowledge does not disappear. It goes underground. And eventually it influences behavior unconsciously. The empath who refuses to acknowledge anger may become passive-aggressive. The empath who refuses to acknowledge resentment may suddenly explode. The empath who refuses to acknowledge limits may eventually disappear without explanation. The mature empath does something different. They bring the shadow into awareness. They say, I am angry. Then they ask why. I am resentful. Then they ask what boundary was violated. I feel exhausted. Then they ask what they have been overgiving. I want distance. Then they ask whether distance is necessary for healing. This is conscious emotional life. And it produces something far healthier than endless positivity. It produces integrity. Integrity means your outer behavior increasingly matches your inner truth. You don't smile while secretly collapsing. You don't say yes while secretly praying the person leaves. You don't promise availability you cannot provide. You don't pretend everything is fine to protect someone else's comfort. You become honest. And honesty is one of the strongest forms of protection an empath can develop. Because manipulation thrives in ambiguity, clarity weakens it. When you know what you will and will not accept, there is less room for emotional confusion. And this is where the mature empath becomes almost impossible to control through guilt. Guilt may still appear, but guilt no longer automatically dictates behavior. They can feel guilty and still say no. They can feel sad and still leave. They can love someone and still create distance. They can understand someone's pain and still refuse to participate in their dysfunction. That is not lack of empathy. It is empathy under conscious control. And perhaps this is the most important transformation in the entire journey. The empath does not eliminate sensitivity. They remove its automatic authority. Feeling becomes information, not instruction. Someone's sadness tells you they are sad. It does not automatically tell you to fix it. Someone's anger tells you they are angry. It does not automatically tell you that you did something wrong. Someone's disappointment tells you they are disappointed. It does not automatically tell you that you must change your decision. That distinction creates sovereignty. And sovereignty changes everything, because once you understand that emotions are information rather than commands, you become much harder to manipulate. You can listen without obeying. You can care without surrendering. You can understand without absorbing. And you can walk away without hatred. That is the Sophia-Stage empath. Not someone who has become incapable of compassion. Someone whose compassion finally has a center. What if the final stage of empathy is not feeling more? What if it is knowing exactly what you are feeling and refusing to carry what belongs to someone else? This is where the entire journey comes together. The empath who began by absorbing everything eventually learns to observe. The person who once rescued everyone learns to support selectively. The person who once apologized for every emotion learns to tolerate discomfort. The person who once confused love with sacrifice learns that love without self-respect becomes self-abandonment. And the person who once believed their purpose was healing everyone discovers something much deeper. Their purpose is not to heal everyone. Their purpose is to become whole. This is where the symbolic idea of the Sophia-Stage empath reaches its highest meaning. Sophia represents wisdom. And wisdom is not the ability to save everyone. Wisdom is knowing what cannot be saved by you. There are people you can encourage, people you can teach, people you can love, people you can support, and people you must release. Not because they are worthless, because their path belongs to them. Jung's vision of individuation points toward this responsibility. The journey inward cannot be completed by another person. Nobody can individuate for you. Nobody can integrate your shadow for you. Nobody can confront your unconscious patterns for you. And the same is true of everyone you love. You cannot individuate for your partner. You cannot integrate your parents' wounds. You cannot heal your friend's trauma. You cannot develop your child's consciousness for them. You can influence. You can model. You can support. But you cannot live their psychological journey. And once an empath accepts this, an enormous weight disappears, the weight of responsibility. You no longer wake up wondering who needs saving today. You wake up asking, what is true for me today? You no longer scan every room for emotional emergencies. You notice what is happening, but you remain centered. You no longer believe every uncomfortable emotion must be resolved. Sometimes sadness can exist. Sometimes anger can exist. Sometimes disappointment can exist. Sometimes silence can exist. Not everything needs to be fixed. This is perhaps the greatest lesson for a sensitive person. Life is not an emotional emergency. Other people's feelings are not always problems you are required to solve. And your discomfort with their discomfort does not create an obligation. This doesn't make you cold. It makes your compassion sustainable. Because when compassion is based on compulsion, eventually it becomes resentment. But when compassion is based on choice, it can remain alive. The Sophia-Stage empath can finally say, I care about you, and I will not destroy myself to prove it. That sentence is a psychological revolution. It changes relationships. It changes friendships. It changes family dynamics. It changes romantic partnerships. It changes how you respond to strangers. It even changes how you relate to your own past. You stop asking, why didn't I save them? And begin asking, why did I believe I had to? That question opens the door to self-forgiveness. Maybe you stayed too long. Maybe you ignored warning signs. Maybe you overgave. Maybe you confused potential with reality. Maybe you believed understanding someone meant tolerating them. But you don't need to hate your former self. That version of you was learning. The old empath survived by adapting. The mature empath survives by differentiating. And the Sophia-Stage empath does something even deeper. They choose consciously. They know when to step forward. They know when to step back. They know when to speak. They know when silence is wiser. They know when forgiveness is appropriate. They know when distance is necessary. They know when compassion helps. And they know when rescue prevents growth. This is not supernatural power. It is psychological maturity. And it is far more practical than the fantasy of becoming immune to other people's emotions. You may always notice things. You may always feel deeply. You may always recognize subtle shifts that others overlook. But sensitivity does not have to mean surrender. You can be sensitive and strong, gentle and firm, compassionate and discerning, open and boundaried, loving and sovereign. That is the integration. And perhaps this is why certain people become uncomfortable when an empath changes. The old version was predictable. The old version could be guilted. The old version could be convinced. The old version would explain endlessly. The old version would return after every betrayal. The old version would carry the emotional burden. But the transformed version is different. They don't need revenge. They don't need dramatic confrontations. They don't need to expose everyone. They simply stop participating, and that is often the most powerful transformation of all. Because when you stop participating in an unhealthy pattern, the pattern loses one of its participants. The cycle cannot continue in exactly the same way. You don't have to defeat the narcissist. You don't have to destroy the manipulator. You don't have to prove your worth. You simply have to stop abandoning yourself. That is enough. And perhaps the greatest paradox is this. The moment you stop trying to heal everyone, your presence may become more healing than it ever was before. Because now your compassion is not coming from desperation. It is coming from wholeness. You don't help people because you need them to need you. You help because you genuinely choose to. You don't listen because you fear abandonment. You listen because you have the capacity. You don't forgive because you're afraid of conflict. You forgive because you have processed the experience. And sometimes forgiveness includes distance. Sometimes love includes goodbye. Sometimes compassion means allowing someone to face the consequences of their own behavior. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can give another person is the responsibility you spent years stealing from them by constantly rescuing them. So if you have reached the point where you no longer want to carry everyone, don't mistake that feeling for becoming selfish. Perhaps you are becoming conscious. If you are tired of explaining yourself, perhaps your psyche is asking for simplicity. If you are tired of rescuing people who refuse to change, perhaps your boundaries are finally speaking. If you are tired of absorbing every emotion in the room, perhaps it is time to ask, is this mine? And if the answer is no, you can let it go. You don't have to fight it. You don't have to analyze it forever. You don't have to return it with anger. You simply don't carry it. That is the final lesson. You were never born to become a container for everyone else's unconsciousness. You were never required to suffer so other people could avoid facing themselves. You were never obligated to sacrifice your peace to prove that you are compassionate. And you were never meant to heal everyone. You were meant to become conscious enough to know the difference between helping and rescuing, between compassion and self-abandonment, between understanding and enabling, between love and obligation, and between what belongs to you and what never did. The old empath asks, who can I save? The awakened empath asks, how can I remain whole? And the Sophia-Stage empath asks something even deeper. How can my wholeness become an example without becoming another person's responsibility? That is where wisdom begins, not when you feel everyone's pain, but when you finally understand that you don't have to carry it. Your sensitivity is not your sentence. Your compassion is not your obligation. Your boundaries are not cruelty. And your healing does not require you to heal the world. Sometimes the most powerful thing an empath can do is stand peacefully inside their own life and let everyone else walk their own path. That is not the end of compassion. That is compassion finally becoming conscious.